Sergeant Whitaker's hand shot forward and locked around Sophia Bennett's collar, yanking her off her feet in front of 390 recruits who stopped breathing all at once. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. A decorated combat veteran chest full of medals was using both hands to crush a 23-year-old woman in front of the entire company, and every single person on that field was waiting to see if she would break. Sophia felt the grip tighten. She felt 390 pairs of eyes on her skin. Then she lifted her face directly into his and said 4 words that nobody in the United States Army had ever said to Marcus Whitaker before. If you've never subscribed to this channel, do it right now and drop your city in the comments so I can see exactly how far this story has traveled. The day Sophia Bennett arrived at Fort Liberty, North Carolina, she carried 1 bag, 1 photograph, and 1 promise. The bag held everything the Army told her to bring. The photograph was her brother Daniel in his dress uniform, taken 3 weeks before the deployment that killed him. And the promise, the one she made standing beside his casket while her mother pressed a folded flag against her chest, was the kind of promise that doesn't have words attached to it. It lives somewhere beneath the sternum. It breathes when everything else stops. Sophia was 23 years old, 5'6", 142 pounds. She had a quiet face that people sometimes mistook for shyness. Dark eyes that registered everything around her without ever broadcasting what she was thinking. And hands that had spent years doing hard work. The kind of work that doesn't show up on a resume, but shows up in the way a person carries herself under pressure. She had worked since she was 15. Waitressing, construction cleanup, inventory management at a warehouse where the overnight shifts ran until 4 in the morning, and nobody thanked you for staying late. She had put herself through 2 years of community college while working 30 hours a week, and still managed to score high enough on the ASVAB that her recruiter had leaned back in his chair and said, "You sure you want infantry?" She said yes, because Daniel had always said infantry was where you found out who you really were. She arrived at Fort Liberty on a Tuesday morning in late June, when the humidity was already sitting at 87%, and the air felt less like something you breathed and more like something you wore. She stood with a group of about 40 other recruits, waiting for transport to the reception battalion, and she noticed the way people were already sorting themselves. The loud ones gravitating toward each other, the quiet ones finding corners, the nervous ones trying very hard to look like they weren't. Sophia stood near the middle. Not because she didn't have a preference, but because she understood that the first hours of any new environment were information-gathering hours, and the people who spent those hours performing were the people who ran out of information first. She watched a young man named Dion Washington trying to make everyone laugh. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and had the kind of laugh that invited other people to laugh with him. She watched a young woman named Priya Navarro, standing rigid and formal, her chin up and her eyes forward, like she'd been rehearsing this moment for years. She watched a pale, thin kid with wire-rimmed glasses named Tommy Chen, who kept rechecking his bags as if something might have fallen out between the last time he checked and this time. Sophia cataloged all of them without judgment. She would need to know these people. Maybe not today, maybe not for weeks. But in the Army, the person standing next to you is sometimes the only thing standing between you and something irreversible. The bus arrived, they loaded, and 40 minutes later, the gates of Fort Liberty closed behind them like a chapter ending. The first week was what everyone said basic training would be: exhausting, disorienting, designed to strip away whatever identity you'd built in the civilian world and replace it with something the Army could work with. Sophia understood the logic of that. She didn't resent it. She had come here to be remade, and being remade required being taken apart first. But she noticed in those first days that the taking apart process was not applied equally. Some recruits were challenged, some recruits were broken. The difference, Sophia was beginning to understand, had less to do with their performance and more to do with something else. Something she couldn't quite name yet, but could feel in the way certain interactions left her with a cold sensation at the base of her throat. She met Sergeant Marcus Whitaker on day 4. He walked into the barracks at 5:47 in the morning, while most recruits were still in the first drowning seconds of consciousness, and he stood at the center of the room and said nothing for a full 30 seconds. Just stood there, letting the silence become its own kind of pressure. Sophia was already awake. She'd been awake since 4:30, lying on her bunk in the dark, running through the day's schedule in her mind, going over the manual of arms until the movements felt like breathing. She watched him through the dim light and noticed things. His bearing was immaculate. That wasn't performance. It was decades of habit so deeply ingrained it had become involuntary. His chest carried ribbons that told a story of real service in real combat, and Sophia felt genuine respect for that because she knew what it cost. She knew what deployment cost a family. She had sat at a kitchen table and watched her mother not sleep for 11 months. But she also noticed something else. The way his eyes moved through the room wasn't the way a trainer's eyes moved. A trainer scanned for weakness to address it. What Whitaker's eyes were doing was different. They were scanning for targets. "Get up," he said. Not loudly, but in the way that quiet authority sometimes carries further than shouting. Everyone scrambled. Sophia was already on her feet. Whitaker's eyes landed on her, held there for 3 seconds, then moved on. She filed that away, said nothing. On day 6, the company ran the obstacle course for the first time. Sophia finished in the top quarter of her cohort, not first, but solidly above the middle and well ahead of several recruits who were physically larger than her. She was breathing hard at the end, hands on her knees, but she was upright. Sergeant Whitaker walked past her without comment. He stopped beside Dion Washington, who had also performed well, and said, "Good work, Washington. That's how it's done." Dion nodded. "Thank you, Drill Sergeant." Whitaker moved on. Sophia watched. She wasn't hurt by the omission. She was curious about it. And curiosity, she had learned from her father, was safer than emotion when you were trying to understand a situation accurately. "Don't take it personally," said a voice beside her. She turned. Priya Navarro was standing there, her face damp with sweat, her chest still heaving from the run. "I'm not," Sophia said. "He does it to women," Priya said quietly. "And he does it to anyone he thinks doesn't fit his idea of what a soldier should look like. I've been here 3 weeks longer than you. I've watched." Sophia looked at her. "What happens to the ones he targets?" Priya's expression shifted into something that wasn't quite sadness and wasn't quite anger. "Most of them get out, one way or another." Sophia nodded slowly. "Not all of them, though." Priya looked at her for a long moment. "No, not all of them." That night, Sophia took out a small notebook, the kind with a hard cover and narrow-ruled pages that she'd bought at a drugstore the week before shipping out. She opened it to the first page, and she wrote the date, the time, what she had observed. She didn't write it as a complaint. She wrote it the way her father had taught her to write things factually, precisely, without embellishment. Because embellishment was what people attacked when they didn't want to believe the facts. Strip the emotion away from the record. Keep the emotion for yourself. And what you're left with is something that can survive scrutiny. She would fill 12 pages before the confrontation that changed everything. By the end of the second week, the pattern Priya had described became impossible for Sophia to dismiss as coincidence. Whitaker had developed what he might have called a training philosophy. But what Sophia's documentation was increasingly revealing as a selection process, a systematic effort to identify recruits he had pre-decided didn't belong and apply enough sustained pressure to make them self-select out. It was elegant in a dark way, because it never crossed a line clearly enough to trigger a formal complaint. Every individual action could be explained. Every extra physical training session could be justified. Every public correction could be framed as necessary discipline. But the aggregate, the relentless, targeted, cumulative aggregate directed at specific individuals, was something else entirely. Sophia was third on his list, she calculated. After a young man named Jerome, who had quietly requested a transfer in the second week, and a woman named Angela, who had simply disappeared from the barracks one morning without saying goodbye. On day 11, Whitaker called Sophia out during a rifle maintenance session. "Bennett?" "Yes, Drill Sergeant." "Your weapon." She handed it over. He inspected it with the slow, deliberate theater of someone who has already decided what verdict they're going to deliver. "This," he said, holding the rifle at an angle only he could see, "is not satisfactory." Sophia said nothing. "What do you call this?" He pointed to something she couldn't see from where she was standing. I don't know what you're referring to, Drill Sergeant. Of course you don't. He handed it back. Clean it again. Then run the back perimeter 3 times. Around her, other recruits kept their eyes carefully forward, which was both an act of self-preservation and, Sophia understood, a small act of shame. She ran the perimeter 3 times in the heat. And when she came back, she picked up her notebook and wrote down the time, the instruction, and the condition of the rifle as she had left it, which was spotless because she had cleaned it the night before, with the same precision she brought to everything she cared about. Day 14 brought the first time he raised his voice at her specifically. Not the general raised voice of a drill sergeant managing a formation, but the pointed, personal, you-specifically raised voice that has a different texture to it. They were in the middle of a physical fitness evaluation. Sophia was in the last third of the group, not because she was slow, but because Whitaker had reassigned her position in the lineup at the last minute, and by the time she arrived at the pull-up station, the bar had been adjusted to a height that required her to jump to reach it. She jumped. She reached. She pulled. She completed 11 pull-ups, 3 more than the requirement for her category. That's not how you grip the bar, Whitaker said, appearing beside her. She released and landed. I was using an overhand grip, Drill Sergeant, as required. I didn't ask for your analysis. No, Drill Sergeant. Do it again. Underhand this time. She looked at him. The evaluation standard specifies, "Are you arguing with me right now?" The formation around her was very still. No, Drill Sergeant. Then get back on the bar. She got back on the bar. She completed 9 underhand pull-ups, which was still above the standard. He walked away without recording her score. That night, she wrote it all down. She wrote it calmly, in her small, precise handwriting, the way her father had taught her. And then she sat on the edge of her bunk in the dark and thought about Jerome and Angela and about what her brother Daniel would say to her right now. She knew what he would say. He would say, "Don't let them make you smaller. You'll need all of your size for what comes next." On day 17, Priya came to her bunk after lights out and sat beside her in the dark. "He talked to Captain Reynolds about you today," Priya said in a low voice. "After dinner. I was outside the office. I heard him say you were showing signs of being a liability." Sophia absorbed that. A liability. "He said you had an attitude problem, that you were resistant to correction." "He's pre-building a record," Sophia said. "Yes. Has he done this to others?" Priya was quiet for a moment. "A woman named Martinez, 2 years ago before I got here. I heard about it from someone who was in her cohort. She filed a complaint and it went nowhere. They said she couldn't handle the training environment." Sophia thought about that for a long time. Then she said, "He's betting that the complaints will go nowhere because they always have. He's counting on the pattern holding. Isn't that exactly what will happen?" "Maybe," Sophia said, "unless the documentation is so precise that there's no room for interpretation." Priya looked at her. "You've been keeping records." "Since day 4. The silence between them stretched out. "Sophia," Priya finally said, "you know what happens to people who push back against someone like him." "I know what's happened so far," Sophia said. "That doesn't mean it's what has to keep happening." Priya left, and Sophia opened her notebook and kept writing. On day 20, Whitaker introduced what he called pressure testing, a series of exercises designed, he explained, to simulate the psychological stress of combat situations. Most recruits found them genuinely valuable. They were hard. They required focus and adaptability. Sophia engaged with them fully and performed above standard, which she was beginning to understand was precisely the problem, because Whitaker had built his case on the premise that she couldn't handle pressure, and every time she handled pressure well, that case weakened, so the pressure had to increase. The targeting had to become more overt, because if she succeeded at every reasonable challenge, the only option for someone committed to a conclusion he'd already reached was to make the challenges unreasonable. On day 23, he made her run the obstacle course twice, while the rest of her cohort watched. On day 25, he docked her 5 points on a written examination for handwriting he described as non-standard. On day 27, he reassigned her to kitchen duty on the same morning as a leadership evaluation, which meant she missed the evaluation entirely. She documented every single one. And then, on day 29, she made a decision. She filed a preliminary concern report. Not a formal complaint, but the kind of documented notification that created a paper trail with the unit equal opportunity officer. She did it quietly during a lunch period after checking 3 times that she had the correct procedure. The EO officer, a captain named Simmons, had a round face and careful eyes and the practiced neutral expression of someone who has heard many things and learned not to react to any of them until he understood them fully. He read her preliminary report. Then he looked up at her. "Private Bennett, are you aware of the potential professional consequences of submitting documentation like this while still in basic training?" "Yes, sir," she said. "I'm also aware of what happens to the consequences when there's no documentation at all." He looked at her for a long moment. "Keep your records current," he said. "Every date, every witness name, every specific statement you can attribute." "Yes, sir." "And private—" He paused. "Don't give him anything to work with." She walked back to her barracks and opened her notebook. She wrote Day 29. 12:47 hours. Filed preliminary concern. EO Officer Simmons reviewed, and then she underlined the last thing he had said to her because it told her something important. Don't give him anything to work with, which meant there was something to work with, which meant someone with rank and visibility was paying attention. She closed the notebook. She went back to training, and she waited. The morning of weapons inspection was 32 days after she arrived at Fort Liberty. The entire company gathered on the training field, 390 recruits standing in formation under the kind of sky that has no mercy in it. The instructors moved through the lines. Sophia had cleaned her weapon the night before with the methodical care she brought to every task that mattered, and she had cleaned it again at 4:30 in the morning, and it was immaculate. She knew Whitaker would inspect her personally. She knew because he had been escalating, and this was the next escalation, and the escalations had a logic to them. Each one pushed a little further, tested a little harder because he was waiting for her to break or make a mistake, or give him something he could use to formally document what he had already decided about her. He came through the line with 2 other instructors flanking him. He passed 3 recruits without stopping. He stopped in front of Sophia. The formation went very quiet. He took her rifle. He turned it over in his hands with theatrical slowness. He held it up at angles that would catch any flaw if a flaw existed. There was no flaw. He lowered the rifle. He looked at her, and something shifted in his face, something that Sophia recognized because she had seen it in smaller moments before. It was the moment when a person who is committed to a course of action realizes that the course of action isn't working, and the choice at that moment is to acknowledge it or to double down. Whitaker doubled down. "Unacceptable," he said. The word landed in the silence like a stone in still water. "Drill sergeant," she started. "Did I give you permission to speak?" "No, drill sergeant." "Then close your mouth and listen to what I'm about to tell you." He stepped closer. He lowered his voice slightly, not enough to be inaudible to the recruits nearest to her, but enough to create the impression of privacy, of intimacy, of a personal assessment, rather than a public one. "You have been a problem since day 1, he said. "I have watched you perform adequately in some areas, and I have watched you fail in others, and I will tell you what I've concluded. I've concluded that you do not belong here, that you are taking a slot that should belong to someone who actually has what it takes. And I am going to spend every remaining day of your basic training making sure that conclusion gets recorded in a way that follows you." Sophia felt her heart rate climb. She felt the fear. She wasn't going to pretend she didn't feel it because the fear was real and honest and dismissing. It would be the same as lying to herself. She felt the fear of authority, the fear of consequence, the fear of being alone in front of 390 people and having no one step forward. But underneath the fear was something else, something that had been building for 32 days and 12 pages of documentation. She met his eyes. "Drill sergeant," she said. Her voice was steady. She was surprised by how steady it was. "I need to inform you that everything you just said has been heard by multiple witnesses. I don't care what's been heard, and that I have filed a preliminary concern with the Equal Opportunity Officer on day 29, documenting 27 specific incidents including today's rifle inspection. The temperature of his expression changed. "You filed. And that Article 93 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice prohibits cruelty and maltreatment of subordinates by any person subject to the code regardless of rank or combat record." The words came out even and clear, and each one landed in the silence of that field, with 390 people listening. "Private Bennett," he said quietly, and there was something in his voice now that hadn't been there before. "You are making a very serious mistake." "I documented a very serious pattern," she said. "Those aren't the same thing." And then his hand shot forward. He grabbed her collar. He pulled her toward him, and 390 witnesses stopped breathing. In the seconds that followed, the seconds that felt longer than they were, because of the way shock dilates time, Sophia did not fight him. She did not pull away. She did not shout or cry or give him the image of chaos he may have been reaching for. She stood very still. She looked him directly in the face, and she said 3 words: "Witnesses are watching." Sergeant Marcus Whitaker released her collar, and in doing so in front of 390 people, he handed her the most powerful evidence she had ever collected. Not a note in a notebook, not a date and a time. A moment that hundreds of human beings had seen with their own eyes. Sophia stepped back. She straightened her collar. She looked down the formation at Priya, who had tears on her face. At Dayan, who was standing very straight and very still, and whose eyes were saying something Sophia could read clearly across the distance. At Tommy Chen, who had his jaw clenched tight and his hands at his sides in fists. At all 390 of them. And she understood in that moment, not as an abstraction, but as a physical fact. She could feel in her chest that she was no longer alone in what was coming. She had never been the only one. She had just been the first one to say it out loud. Nobody moved. That was the thing Sophia would remember most clearly later. Not what she said, not the way his hand dropped, not even the sound of her own voice cutting through 390 people's silence. What she would remember was the stillness. The way every single person on that field had frozen mid-breath, like the world had pressed pause on itself and was waiting to find out if it would remember how to start again. Sergeant Whitaker stood 2 feet away from her. His hand was at his side now, but the shape of what he had just done was still hanging in the air between them, visible and undeniable, the way smoke hangs after a fire has been extinguished. He looked at her for 5 full seconds. Then he turned and walked away. No word, no dismissal, no explanation. Just the sound of his boots on the ground getting smaller, and behind him, 389 people releasing their breath in a collective exhale that sounded like the world coming back online. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Priya's voice came from 3 positions to Sophia's left, low and urgent. "Sophia, don't move. Don't say anything else." Sophia wasn't planning to. She was standing completely still. Her collar straightened, her rifle at her side, her heart going at a rate she could feel in her temples. She was cataloging everything, the time, the witnesses, the exact sequence of events. Not because she was calm, but because cataloging was the thing she knew how to do when everything else was in motion. The inspection continued, or tried to. The 2 instructors who had been flanking Whitaker exchanged a look that they probably believed was private but wasn't, and then one of them, a staff sergeant named Okafor, walked through the remaining inspection with the mechanical efficiency of someone performing a task while their mind is somewhere else entirely. The other one, a young corporal whose name Sophia didn't know yet, kept his eyes precisely determinedly forward, in a way that meant he was working very hard not to look at anything that had just happened. Formation broke 20 minutes later. Sophia walked back to the barracks with the same controlled pace she always used, aware that at least 14 pairs of eyes were tracking her movement. She sat on her bunk. She opened her notebook. She wrote the time, 09:17, and then she wrote everything in the sequence it had occurred, every word she could reconstruct, every physical action she could document, before memory could blur the edges. She was still writing when Dion Washington appeared in the doorway. He stood there for a second without speaking, which was unusual for Dayon, whose natural mode was sound and motion and easy occupation of whatever space he was in. His silence now felt weighted. "You okay?" he finally said. Sophia looked up from her notebook. Yes, that was... He stopped, started again. I've been in a lot of places where a lot of things happened, and I told myself I was fine with it because that's just how it works. That's just how things are. He paused. I've never seen anybody name it while it was happening. Article 93 is a real regulation, Sophia said. It exists because situations like this are real situations. I know it's a real regulation. He crossed the room and sat on the bunk across from her. He was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that's doing something. I need to tell you something. Sophia waited. He called me into his office 2 weeks ago, Dion said. Told me you were a liability. Told me that soldiers who associate closely with liabilities become liabilities themselves. He paused. I told him I'd keep my distance. The words landed. Sophia kept her expression neutral. Did you... I'm sitting across from you right now, aren't I? She looked at him. I should have told you earlier, he said. I didn't because I was scared. I want you to know I know that. She thought about Daniel, about the things people didn't say because they were scared, and the cost of those unsaid things, and the cost of finally saying them. It takes longer for some people, she said. It doesn't mean it doesn't count. Dion let out a slow breath. What are you going to do? I already did it, she said. I filed a preliminary report with the EO officer 3 days ago. What happened this morning gave that report a foundation. She looked down at her notebook. What I need now is witnesses willing to confirm what they saw. Dion was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I saw. Sophia wrote his name down. That afternoon changed the barracks in ways that were hard to describe, but impossible to miss. The energy shifted the way energy always shifts after something has been named that everyone has been carefully not naming. It wasn't relief exactly. It wasn't solidarity yet. It was more like the specific discomfort of people who have been walking around a fact for weeks and have suddenly found the fact standing directly in front of them too large to walk around anymore. Tommy Chen came to find her during the dinner hour. He stood at the end of her bunk row with his hands pressed flat against his thighs, which she had come to understand was what Tommy did when he was nervous and trying not to show it. I heard about Dion, he said. Sophia looked up from the manual she was studying. Sit down, Tommy. He sat. He was quiet for so long that Sophia went back to her manual, and then he said, My father was in the Navy, 22 years. He used to say that the hardest thing about military service isn't the enemy outside, it's the culture inside that decides who counts and who doesn't. Sophia set the manual down. What happened to him? Tommy's jaw worked. He filed a complaint once, against a superior officer who was running his division into the ground. Not for himself, for the younger sailors. People who didn't know the system well enough to protect themselves. He paused. The complaint was dismissed. He was transferred to a posting so remote it was basically disappearing. He served out his term and came home and never talked about the Navy again. Sophia felt the weight of that land in her chest. I'm sorry. I didn't come here to tell you my family history, he said. His voice had a new quality to it, something harder than his usual careful precision, something that had been sitting under all that careful precision waiting for the right moment. I came to tell you I was standing 2 positions from you this morning. I heard every word. I saw what he did. He paused. I'll say so in writing. Sophia looked at him. My father didn't have anyone behind him, Tommy said. That was the difference. They could isolate him because there was nobody else. You don't have to be isolated. She added his name to the notebook. By 9 o'clock that night, 8 people had come to her, not all at once. In the way things like this happen one at a time, each one carrying their own version of the same weight, each one arriving at the decision through a slightly different internal journey that led to the same external act. They sat with her or stood in the doorway or spoke to her in low voices in the 3 minutes between lights out warning and actual lights out, and each one said some version of the same thing I saw. I'll say so. By 9 o'clock that night, Sophia had 8 named witnesses in her notebook, all of whom had been standing within clear visual and auditory range of the confrontation that morning. She lay on her bunk in the dark after lights out and thought about what that meant. And what it meant was, this was no longer a single recruit's complaint against a decorated drill sergeant with decades of institutional protection. This was the beginning of a corroborated account. A corroborated account was something different. A corroborated account was something that required a response. She fell asleep with the notebook under her pillow. She woke up at 4:30 and wrote down 2 things she had thought of in her sleep. The first was cross-reference dates. Other recruits who left before completing training voluntary withdrawals in the past 3 years. Pattern in timing relative to Whitaker's assignment. The second was Martinez. 2 years ago. Find out what happened to that complaint. She underlined both of them. Then she got up and started her day. What she didn't know, couldn't have known yet, was that while she had been gathering witness names in the barracks, something else had been happening at the other end of Fort Liberty. Captain Raymond Simmons, Equal Opportunity Officer, had been awake past midnight, reviewing the preliminary report Sophia had filed on day 29. He had received that same evening an informal call from Staff Sergeant Okafor, who had been one of the 2 instructors flanking Whitaker during the weapons inspection. Okafor had not been calling to report anything officially. He was calling, he said, to ask a question about EO procedures. Specifically, he was asking what the procedure was when an observer, not a victim but a neutral observer, witnessed an incident that might constitute maltreatment. Simmons told him. Okafor said he understood. He said thank you. He ended the call. Simmons put down the phone and sat at his desk for a while. Then he opened Sophia's file and read it again from the beginning. Sophia found out about that call 3 days later from a source she wasn't expecting. She was running the morning PT circuit when Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Drummond fell into step beside her. Lieutenant Colonel Drummond was not part of Basic Training Command. She was attached to the Inspector General's office, and her presence on the PT track at 6 in the morning was not accidental. Sophia registered all of this in the first 2 seconds of Drummond's appearance and kept running. "You have a good pace," Drummond said without any preamble. "Thank you, ma'am. I've been reviewing some documents," Drummond said. She wasn't breathing hard. Whatever she had been doing before 6 in the morning, it had involved enough physical activity that a PT run didn't inconvenience her. Preliminary concern reports, witness statements, training records going back approximately 30 months. Sophia kept her pace steady. "Yes, ma'am." "What you filed on day 29, Drummond said, was the 4th preliminary concern report filed against the same individual in the past 3 years. The previous 3 were dismissed at the initial review stage." Sophia processed that without breaking stride. Dismissed on what grounds? Insufficient corroboration. Complainants declined to pursue formal investigation. Drummond paused. In 2 of the 3 cases, the complainants had voluntarily separated from training before the preliminary review was complete. Sophia thought about Jerome, about Angela. "They were pressured out," she said. "That's one interpretation. It's the interpretation supported by the pattern." Drummond glanced at her sideways. "Yes, it is." A pause. "Your report is different from the previous 3 in several notable respects. The level of documentation, the specificity, the timeline." Another pause. "And the fact that you're still here. I intend to keep being here." "I know," Drummond said. "That's why I'm talking to you." They ran in silence for 30 seconds. Then Drummond said, "I need to tell you something that I am telling you as a senior officer offering informal guidance, not as an official communication from the IG's office. Do you understand the distinction?" "Yes, ma'am. What happened at the weapons inspection is going to be investigated. Not because of your report alone, though your report is what built the foundation. Because Staff Sergeant Okafor submitted an incident report last night through the official chain of command." She paused. "That changes the category of this event. It's no longer a recruit's complaint against a drill sergeant. It's a documented incident with corroboration from a peer-level observer." Sophia felt something loosen in her chest. Not relief, it was too early for relief, but a release of a specific tension she'd been holding for 32 days without fully acknowledging it. "Will the investigation be fair?" she asked. Drummond's expression was precise and careful. "The investigation will be thorough," she said. "Whether it's fair will depend on factors above my pay grade. What I can tell you is that the record you've built gives it the best possible chance of being both." She peeled off from the running track at the next corner and was gone. Sophia ran the remaining 2 loops alone. When she got back to the barracks, Priya was waiting for her. "She talked to you," Priya said. "You saw. Everyone saw. You know this place." Priya was watching her with the careful attention of someone trying to read a situation they've been close to for weeks, but not close enough to understand completely. What did she say? Sophia sat down and pulled off her running shoes. Okafor filed an incident report. Priya went very still. "Through official channels," Sophia said, "last night." The silence that followed had a different quality than previous silences. Priya sat down on the bunk beside her, and for a moment neither of them said anything. And what passed between them in that silence was the specific recognition of people who have been carrying something heavy for a long time, and have just felt someone else's hands take some of the weight. "He's going to know it's coming," Priya said. "Yes." "What does he do when he knows something is coming?" Sophia looked at her. "What do you mean? I mean—" Priya stopped, collected herself. 2 years ago, when the woman named Martinez filed her complaint. Before it was dismissed. In the 2 weeks between the filing and the dismissal, 3 people who were on her witness list were assigned to roles that pulled them out of the training environment. One of them got a commendation that transferred him to a different battalion. One of them had a performance review that raised serious enough questions that her own status became the focus. She paused. "He's done this before. Not just the original behavior, the response to the investigation." Sophia was quiet for a moment. "He's going to try to dismantle the corroboration," she said. "He's going to try to dismantle the witnesses," Priya said. "Specifically, individually, by making each one feel like the cost of staying on that list is higher than the benefit." Sophia looked down at the notebook. 8 names. 8 people who had come to her one at a time in the dark, each one carrying their own fear. Each one making a decision that cost them something to make. "We need to talk to all of them today," she said. "Together." No. Together creates a narrative about coordination. Separately, independently, each of them having made their own decision and being reminded that they made it freely. That's different. Priya nodded slowly. "You've thought about this." "I've been thinking about this since day 4, Sophia said. "I just didn't know how many people were going to be thinking alongside me." They split the list between them. What happened over the next 6 hours was not dramatic in the way that the confrontation on the field had been dramatic. It was quieter, and in some ways harder, the specific work of sitting across from someone who is genuinely afraid and helping them hold on to a decision they made when the fear was slightly less acute than it is now. Tommy was the easiest. His commitment was anchored in his father's story in a way that meant Whitaker's pressure would have to dislodge something much deeper than professional calculation. Dion was solid, but honest about it. "I keep thinking about what happens to my record if this goes sideways," he said. "I know that's not the right thing to think about. I'm telling you because you should know what I'm fighting." Sophia looked at him. "I'd rather have someone who's honest about the fight than someone who pretends it isn't happening." A young woman named Rebecca Ostrowski was harder. She had 2 younger siblings at home and a mother working 2 jobs and a scholarship that her continuation in basic training was tied to. The fear in her was not about personal consequences. It was the specific grinding fear of someone who cannot afford a disruption, whose margins are too thin, whose consequences cascade outward to people who didn't choose this situation. Sophia sat with her for 40 minutes. She didn't push. She didn't persuade. She laid out what she knew as clearly as she could, the corroboration that already existed, the level of institutional attention the case had already attracted, the fact that Rebecca's withdrawal from the witness list would not protect her from Whitaker's targeting if he decided to make her a target. And then she said, "Whatever you decide, I will not blame you. I know what you're carrying." Rebecca pressed her fingers against her eyes for a moment. Then she said, "My mom always told me you don't get to look your kids in the eye on the other side of something if you flinched when it counted." Sophia wrote nothing in the notebook. Rebecca didn't need to be written down. She was already there. By evening, all 8 witnesses had confirmed. Sophia updated her documentation and cross-referenced it against the training records she had access to, the ones that were part of the public schedule, and she began building the timeline she had thought of that morning. The pattern of voluntary early separations correlated with Whitaker's assignment cycle. The months with the highest separation rates were the months when his rotation included the specific cohorts she was reconstructing from schedule records and barrack conversations. She was 3/4 through this reconstruction when Priya appeared and sat beside her with the particular expression of someone who has received information they didn't go looking for. "One of the administrative clerks," Priya said quietly. "She came to find me." Sophia looked up. "She said there's a meeting tomorrow morning between Whitaker and 2 members of his JAG representation and someone from the training battalion command." Sophia absorbed that. He's already lawyered up. He already had someone. The call was made tonight. Priya paused. "And there's something else." The clerk said one of the names on the meeting roster is the training battalion's executive officer. Another pause. XO Holbrook. The name landed differently, because XO Holbrook was the officer who had signed off on the original dismissal of the Martinez complaint 2 years ago. Sophia sat very still for a long moment. Then she said, "Call Captain Simmons." Tonight, Sophia said. "Tell him the roster of tomorrow's meeting. Tell him specifically about Holbrook. And tell him I need to know if there's a conflict of interest disclosure requirement for officers involved in prior dismissals of related complaints." Priya took out her phone. Sophia looked back at the notebook. This was the thing Whitaker hadn't calculated. The thing that changed the arithmetic of everything he had done and everything he was planning to do. He had built his strategy on a simple premise that complaints went nowhere because the system was configured to make them go nowhere. And the people in the positions that mattered were people who had benefited from that configuration. What he hadn't anticipated was a 23-year-old woman who had spent 32 days doing the specific kind of preparation that makes a system's configuration suddenly visible. Not just visible to her, visible to the people inside the system who still believed in what it was supposed to be. Simmons picked up on the second ring, and the meeting that had been scheduled for 9 o'clock the next morning was restructured before midnight, with a new name added to the attendance list. Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Drummond, representing the Inspector General's office. Sophia found out about that restructuring the next morning when Dayon appeared at her bunk door at 5:15, with his eyes wide and something happening in his face that was equal parts astonishment and something that hadn't quite resolved itself into a name yet. "What did you do?" he said. She was already dressed, already had the notebook. "What I always do," she said. "I documented." He looked at her for a long moment. "Sophia," he said, "there are 3 recruiters who have been reassigned from their posts this week, pulled back to Fort Liberty for interviews." She looked up at him. "All 3 of them," he said, "were the primary recruitment contacts for Jerome Angela and the woman named Martinez." The silence stretched. "It's not just Whitaker anymore," Dion said. "No," she agreed. "It hasn't been just Whitaker for a long time. It's just that the records are finally legible." He stood in the doorway for another moment. Then he said, "Whatever you need. Anything. You say the word." She looked at him. Thought about day 6 when he had received the praise and she had received the silence, and neither of them had known yet what that silence was actually made of. "I need you to be exactly what you've been," she said. "Honest, present, willing to say what you saw." "That's easy," he said. "It was never easy," she said. "That's exactly why it matters." He nodded. Something in his face settled, not resolved, because there was still too much motion in what was happening around them for resolution, but settled in the way a person settles when they have found the ground under their feet. He left. Sophia opened her notebook to a fresh page. At the top she wrote the date. Below it she wrote a single word: "Proceed." Then she went to meet her day. The 9 o'clock meeting happened behind closed doors, and Sophia was not in the room. That was the part people didn't understand about this kind of fight, the part that movies always got wrong. The protagonist isn't in the room when the important decisions get made. The protagonist is running PT circuits and cleaning her weapon, and sitting through instruction sessions and performing every single daily requirement of basic training with the same precision she brought on day one. Because the moment she gives anyone a legitimate reason to question her conduct, the story stops being about what Whitaker did and starts being about what Sophia did. That was the trap. She understood it completely. And so she ran her circuits and cleaned her weapon and sat through her instruction sessions while somewhere on the other side of Fort Liberty, people with rank and authority were in a room deciding how seriously to take the records she had spent 32 days building. Priya updated her during the lunch hour. Drummond was in there for 90 minutes. Priya said, her voice low, her tray untouched in front of her. When she came out, Holbrook wasn't with her. Sophia looked up. He left early. He didn't leave. He was asked to step out. Priya paused. There's a word going around that the IG's office submitted a conflict of interest notation related to his prior involvement in the Martinez dismissal. He's been recused from any advisory role in this investigation. The first domino. Sophia felt it, the precise physical sensation of something shifting, something that had been load-bearing, suddenly becoming structural rather than obstructive. She picked up her fork. She ate. Because she needed calories, and because the ability to perform routine functions under pressure was one of the things this process was going to require of her over and over for as long as it lasted. "What about Whitaker's JAG?" she asked. "Still in the meeting when I left. Drummond brought someone from the IG's legal team." Priya finally picked up her own fork. "Sophia, the JAG they brought, she's not a base assignment. She was brought in specifically." "From where?" "Forcecom," Priya said, quietly. "The way you say something when the weight of it is still settling on you. Forces command level." Sophia set her fork down. "Sophia, Forces Command didn't send legal staff to a drill sergeant's preliminary meeting because a recruit filed a concern report. Forces Command sent legal staff when a preliminary meeting had the potential to expose liability at a level that exceeded what base command could manage independently. Which meant the documentation had done something she had hoped for but hadn't let herself count on. It had made the scope of this visible to people with enough altitude to see the whole shape of it. "He knows," Sophia said. "Yes? He knows that this is bigger than him now." "Yes." Priya paused. "Sophia, that makes him more dangerous, not less." "I know." And she did know. She had known it since Priya told her about Martinez, about the way Whitaker responded to threat, not by retreating, but by attacking the architecture of the threat itself. By dismantling witnesses. By creating new problems that became the focus instead of the original problem. By moving the ground under people until they lost their footing. He would be doing that right now, even in that room, even with Drummond present and Forcecom legal sitting across the table. He would be doing exactly what he had been doing for years, constructing a counter-narrative with the same skill and institutional knowledge he brought to everything. Because he was not a stupid man, and he was not an inexperienced one. And the thing that had allowed this to go on for as long as it had was precisely that he understood the system well enough to use it. The afternoon brought the first sign of what that counter-narrative looked like. Sophia was in the middle of a land navigation session when Corporal Davis, the young corporal who had stood beside Okafor at the weapons inspection and kept his eyes so carefully forward, appeared at the edge of the training area and told her that Sergeant First Class Morrow wanted to see her. Sergeant First Class Morrow was not part of her training cadre. He ran the battalion's physical readiness program, a position with significant administrative authority over training evaluations. Sophia had spoken to him exactly once during an introductory briefing in week 1. She went. His office had the particular atmosphere of a room being used to accomplish something it wasn't officially designated for a certain quality of stillness, of preparation. Morrow was a large man with careful eyes and the manner of someone who had learned a long time ago that the most effective way to apply pressure was to make it look like something else. "Private Bennett," he said. "Sit down." She sat. "I want to talk to you about your training trajectory," he said. "Of course, Sergeant First Class. I've been reviewing your performance evaluations over the past 4 weeks." He opened a folder. "Some areas of genuine strength. Navigation marksmanship fundamentals, written assessment scores, all solid. He paused. But there are some notes here about adaptability under high-stress command environments that give me some concern. Sophia said nothing. She was watching his hands on the folder. Specifically, he said there are observations from multiple training NCOs suggesting that you have difficulty accepting correction from superior personnel. That you have a tendency toward, he looked at the paper, counterproductive independence. There it was. The counter-narrative. Being inserted into her official record, being built into language that sounded administrative and neutral and therefore credible, while she sat in a chair on the wrong side of a desk, and the real conversation happening was nothing like the one he was pretending to have. "Sergeant First Class," she said, "I'd like to know the names and dates of the observations you're referencing." He looked up from the folder. "I don't think that's..." Under AR 623-3 evaluation reports are required to include the identity of the evaluating official and the specific performance period observed. She kept her voice completely even. "I'm asking for that information so I can accurately respond to any notes in my record." The pause that followed was exactly 2 seconds long. "You're familiar with the regulation?" he said. "I am." "That's..." He stopped. The careful eyes recalibrated slightly. "That's not typical for a recruit at your stage." "I do a lot of reading," she said. Another pause. The folder closed. "Private Bennett," he said, and the tone had shifted, not warmer, but different, the way a person's voice shifts when they have been doing one thing and are considering doing another. "What you're involved in right now it's more complicated than you may understand. There are people here who have given decades to this institution. People who have served in ways that decisions get made in context. You understand context." "I understand that context doesn't change whether something happened," she said. "It might explain it. It doesn't change it." He looked at her for a long moment. "You can go," he said. She stood. She walked to the door. She stopped with her hand on the frame. "Sergeant First Class," she said. "Whatever notes are currently in my evaluation file, I'd like a copy within 24 hours per the AR." She left before he could respond. She went directly to the latrine, which was the only reliably private space in the training environment, and stood at the sink with the water running, and took 12 controlled breaths. Not because she was falling apart, she wasn't, but because her body needed a moment to process what her mind had just handled, and ignoring that need was the kind of mistake that caught up with you later. Then she dried her hands. She walked back to her bunk. She opened the notebook and wrote down every word of the conversation she could reconstruct, including his exact phrasing about counterproductive independence, because that specific phrase in an official record was something that could be compared against official Army leadership doctrine and found to describe something that doctrine did not support. She had been writing for 11 minutes when Tommy sat down across from her with an expression that told her something had happened. "Rebecca," he said. Sophia looked up. "Someone from Battalion Admin called her in this afternoon, during the land nav session." He paused. "She said they asked her to clarify her understanding of the events on the training field, very formally, with a recorder." Sophia closed the notebook. She wasn't notified in advance. No, they just pulled her out of training. Did she have representation? No, she didn't know she was entitled to it. She didn't know to ask. This was it. This was the move Priya had described, not the attack on Sophia directly, because Sophia was too visible now, but the methodical, quiet pressure applied to the people around her. The witnesses. One at a time. In private rooms where they didn't know their rights and didn't know they could say, "Wait, I want someone with me," and the absence of that knowledge was being treated as consent. "Where is she now?" Sophia asked. "Barracks." Sophia went. Rebecca was sitting on her bunk with the particular stillness of someone who has just been through something and hasn't finished processing it yet. Her hands were in her lap. Her face was doing the work of appearing composed. "Tell me what they asked you," Sophia said. Rebecca looked at her. "They were very..." She stopped. "They were very polite. That was the thing. They were so polite that I kept thinking maybe I was misreading it. They asked me if I was sure about what I'd seen. Not in an aggressive way. In a careful way. Like they were concerned I might have misunderstood something." "What did you say?" I said I was sure. She paused. Then they asked me if I was aware that Sergeant Whitaker had a distinguished service record that included multiple combat deployments and commendations for valor. She looked at her hands. I said yes. They said they were just making sure I had that context before I formalized anything. Sophia sat beside her. Rebecca, you were being discouraged. That's not concern. That's a pressure technique. I know that now. She looked up. I said the same thing I said to you. I saw what I saw. I'll say so in writing. Did you tell them that? I told them I needed time to consider whether I wanted to make a formal statement. A pause. Sophia, I panicked. I know I should have been stronger. You didn't commit to anything you didn't mean, Sophia said, and you didn't withdraw anything. She put a hand briefly on Rebecca's arm. That's not panic. That's being smart in a room where you were outnumbered and unsupported. Rebecca let out a long breath. I need you to do something, Sophia said. I need you to write down everything that happened in that room, every question they asked, exactly how they asked it, before tonight. Why? Because if they're conducting informal interviews with witnesses without legal representation and without advance notification, that process may itself be a violation of the investigation protocols. And the only way to make that visible is to document it. Rebecca stared at her. You turned a pressure meeting into evidence, she said slowly. They handed it to us, Sophia said. I just need you to write it down. 3 hours later, Sophia had reconstruction accounts from Rebecca and from a young man named Garrett Ellison, who had also been pulled for an informal session that afternoon. She compiled them into an addendum to her existing documentation, organized it chronologically, and at 7:30 that evening, she submitted it to Captain Simmons with a cover note that used the phrase witness tampering exactly once at the end after she had laid out every supporting fact in sequence. She chose the placement deliberately. Let the facts do the convincing. Let the conclusion arrive as something the reader reached themselves. That was what her father had taught her people: hold tighter to conclusions they believed they discovered than conclusions they were told. Simmons responded within 40 minutes. He didn't call. He sent a written acknowledgement through the official EO communication system, which meant it was timestamped and logged. The acknowledgement said, received and logged. Continue documenting. Do not discuss content with anyone outside your named witness group. Sophia read it twice. Then she sat on her bunk and thought about Whitaker in a way she hadn't allowed herself to think about him before, not as an obstacle, not as a threat, but as a human being who had made a long series of choices that had led him to this specific moment, and who had made those choices inside a system that had repeatedly told him that the choices were acceptable. She didn't feel sorry for him. That would have been dishonest. But she felt something adjacent to understanding the cold, clear recognition of how a person becomes what he had become, and why dismantling the behavior required, dismantling the system that had enabled it, not just removing the individual. Because if you removed Whitaker and changed nothing else, the next person who filled his role would have the same tools available, the same institutional silence, the same pattern of dismissed complaints and transferred victims and commendations that functioned as protective coloring. This was the thing she needed the investigation to see. Not just one man, the whole architecture. Priya came in at 8:15. He made a statement, she said. Sophia looked up. Through his JAG, this afternoon. An official statement to the investigating officer that was shared with Training Battalion Command. Priya sat down. Her face was doing the thing it did when she was organizing something complicated into something communicable. He said that Private Bennett has demonstrated a pattern of using regulatory language as a tool of aggression against leadership, that she deliberately engineered a confrontation at the weapons inspection, that what happened was not maltreatment, but rather a recruit's tactical manipulation of a training interaction. The words landed in Sophia's chest like stones dropped from a height. Not because they surprised her. She had anticipated something like this. But hearing the specific shape of the argument, hearing the way he had turned her preparation, her documentation, her knowledge of regulation into evidence of bad faith, was different from anticipating it abstractly. He's saying she provoked him, Tommy said from the doorway. He had arrived at some point during Priya's account without anyone noticing. "He's saying she engineered the entire thing," Priya said. "The documentation, the EO filing, the witnesses. He's saying it was a coordinated strategy to destroy his career." "It was a coordinated response to a documented pattern," Sophia said. "Sophia," Priya started. "A coordinated strategy to destroy someone would have looked different," Sophia said. Her voice was steady. She was working to keep it that way, not because she was performing steadiness, but because she genuinely needed it right now. "It would have started with the most serious accusation and tried to land the biggest punch first. What I did started with a preliminary concern filing and built upward based on what kept happening. That's not a strategy to destroy someone. That's a record of events in sequence." "Can you prove the distinction?" Tommy asked. Sophia looked at him. "Because the people in that room," he said carefully, "may not know you the way we know you. They're going to hear his version and your version, and they're going to try to figure out which one has more support in the evidence. Can you prove that you weren't running a campaign?" "The dates prove it," she said. "Every entry in my notebook was written within 24 hours of the incident it documents. The EO filing was on day 29, after 28 days of documented incidents. If this was a coordinated campaign, it was the slowest, most patient campaign in Fort Liberty history." Tommy almost smiled. "That's good." "I know it's good," she said. "But I need it to be more than good. I need it to be airtight." "What does airtight look like?" Priya asked. Sophia was quiet for the moment, thinking. "It looks like one more thing," she said. She looked at them both. Dion appeared in the doorway. She hadn't heard him arrive either, which meant he had been there for a while. "Martinez," she said. "I need to find the woman named Martinez." The silence that followed was different from previous silences. "She separated from the army," Priya said. 2 years ago." "I know. But she's a private citizen now. She's not bound by anything related to this case. She can talk if she wants to." Sophia paused. "And what she says about the pattern of her experience, the sequence of events, the specific techniques he used to discredit her complaint, if that matches what's documented in my notebook, then the argument that I engineered this becomes very hard to sustain. Because I couldn't have engineered a pattern that started 2 years before I arrived." Dion moved fully into the room. He sat down on the nearest bunk. He was quiet for a moment, the productive quiet she had learned to recognize in him. "I know someone who might know how to find her," he said. Sophia looked at him. "One of the admin clerks. Not the one who tipped Priya about the meeting. A different one." He paused. "She and Martinez were in the same cohort. They've stayed in touch. Can you ask her?" "I already did," Dion said. 20 minutes ago." The room went very still. He reached into his pocket and put a folded piece of paper on the bunk between them. A phone number. A name. Private First Class, now Civilian Carmen Martinez. Sophia looked at the paper for a long moment. Then she looked up at the three of them. Priya, Tommy, Dion, standing in this small space with their fear and their commitment and their entirely imperfect courage, each of them carrying the specific weight of having decided that this time would be different from every other time. "Tomorrow morning," she said, before PT. "We have a 6 o'clock formation," Tommy said. "I know," she said. "I'll make the call at 5. She folded the paper. She put it inside the notebook. And she thought about Daniel, who had told her a uniform doesn't make someone powerful. The choices they make while wearing it do. She had made her choices. Now they were going to find out what those choices were made of. Carmen Martinez picked up on the third ring. It was 4:58 in the morning. Sophia was sitting on the floor outside the barracks with her back against the wall and the notebook open across her knees and the folded piece of paper with Carmen's number in her left hand. The air was the specific quality of pre-dawn that feels like the world hasn't committed yet to being awake. She had rehearsed what she was going to say. Then she had thrown out the rehearsal because Carmen Martinez had lived through something real and deserved to be spoken to like a real person, not like a deposition. "Hello?" The voice was careful, alert in the way of someone who checks who's calling before answering and had seen an unfamiliar number and answered anyway. Carmen, Sophia said. My name is Sophia Bennett. I'm a recruit at Fort Liberty. I'm sorry for the hour. A pause. Fort Liberty, Carmen said. Not a question, a recognition. Yes. Another pause, longer this time. Sophia could hear Carmen breathing, could hear the specific quality of a silence that contains a decision being made. How did you get this number? Carmen asked. Someone who was in your cohort. She said you'd stayed in touch. Sophia paused. I wouldn't have called if it wasn't important. Is it Whitaker? Carmen said. Not a question either. Yes, Sophia said. The silence on the other end of the line had a texture to it now, something compressed, something that had been held in a particular shape for 2 years and was now being asked to take a different one. What happened? Carmen asked. Sophia told her. Not everything, there wasn't time for everything, and some of what was in the notebook needed to stay in the notebook until the formal process required it. But she told her the shape of it, the pattern, the weapons inspection, the witness list, the informal sessions with Rebecca and Garrett, the counter-narrative his JAG had submitted, and the reason she was calling at 4:58 in the morning. When she finished, there was a silence that lasted long enough that Sophia almost said Carmen's name. Then Carmen spoke. The thing he does with the record, she said. Her voice had changed, quieter, more deliberate, the voice of someone selecting words, the way you select footing on uncertain ground. Before the formal complaint, he starts building a counter-record, notes about attitude, notes about difficulty accepting correction. He gets other NCOs to co-sign observations that individually sound reasonable, but together create a picture of someone who can't function in the training environment. Yes, Sophia said. Sergeant First Class Morrow, yesterday afternoon. Morrow. A pause. He was there when I went through. He signed 2 of the evaluation notes they used against me at the dismissal hearing. Carmen stopped, collected herself. My complaint was dismissed because the investigating officer said the evidence was insufficient to support the level of maltreatment I alleged. What they didn't say, what I found out later, was that the investigating officer was a former subordinate of Whitaker's. They served together in a combat deployment 12 years ago. Sophia's hand tightened on the notebook. That information wasn't disclosed, she said. No, I found out 6 months after I separated through someone who knew someone. By then the dismissal was final, and I'd signed paperwork, and I was trying to put it behind me. A pause. I was 20 years old. I didn't know what I know now. Carmen. Sophia kept her voice level. The investigating officer for my case. Do you know if it's the same person? I don't know who they assigned to yours. Can you tell me the name of the one assigned to yours? Carmen told her. Sophia wrote it down. I need to ask you something harder now, Sophia said. And I need you to know that whatever you say, I understand. You built a life after what happened. I have no right to ask you to disturb it. The silence lasted 4 seconds. Ask, Carmen said. Would you be willing to submit a statement to the IG's office about what happened to your complaint? Not about Whitaker's conduct, about the process, the evaluation notes, Morrow's involvement, the investigating officer's prior relationship with Whitaker. Sophia paused. The pattern is what protects him. The pattern is what has to be visible. Carmen didn't answer immediately. Sophia waited. She was good at waiting. She had been practicing it for 33 days. I have a job, Carmen finally said. I have a life. I worked very hard to get here. I know. If I submit something, if my name goes on a document connected to this, it follows me. It might, Sophia said honestly. I can't promise you it won't. Another silence. My little sister enlists next year, Carmen said. Her voice was different now, stripped of the careful selection, the deliberate footing, just the truth of it. She's been talking about it for 3 years. She's the one who pushed me toward the army in the first place because she wanted to follow me in. Sophia said nothing. She let that sit where it was. I never told her what happened to me, Carmen said. I didn't want her to be afraid of something she hadn't experienced. A pause. But if he's still there when she arrives, he might be, Sophia said quietly, without the pattern being visible. The line was silent for a long time. "I'll submit a statement," Carmen said. "I want it to go directly to the IG's office, not through base command." "Lieutenant Colonel Drummond?" Sophia said. "I'll give you her direct contact. She's Forcecom level oversight. Nothing you send her goes through the base chain first." "Okay?" A breath. "Sophia." "Yes." "Don't let them make you smaller," Carmen said. "That's what they're designed to do. That's the whole system, make you smaller until you disappear. Don't let them." Sophia heard her brother in that, felt him like a hand between her shoulder blades, steady and present. "I won't," she said. She ended the call at 5:14. She had 12 minutes before formation. She wrote Carmen's name in the notebook. She wrote the name Carmen had given her, the investigating officer from 2 years ago. She underlined it twice. Then she closed the notebook, stood up, straightened her uniform, and walked to formation. The formal investigation opened that same afternoon, not the preliminary inquiry. The full Article 32 investigation, the kind that had a designated investigating officer, a formal timeline, and legal representatives on both sides. The kind that created a record that didn't disappear when someone in the chain of command decided they'd rather it did. Sophia found out from Drummond, who walked past her during afternoon PT, in exactly the way she had the first time, and said without slowing, "It's been formally opened. You'll receive official notification through your chain of command within the hour. Carmen Martinez is going to submit a statement directly to your office," Sophia said, matching her pace. Drummond didn't break stride. "I'll make sure she has a direct channel. And the name of the investigating officer from the Martinez dismissal?" Sophia said it. Drummond's pace didn't change, but something in her posture did a subtle reorganization, a sharpening. "Where did you get that name?" "Martinez told me this morning." Sophia paused. "He had a prior personal relationship with Whitaker. It wasn't disclosed." "I'm aware of the relationship," Drummond said. Her voice was precise. "I was not aware it wasn't disclosed." A pause. "That's going in the file this afternoon." She peeled off. Sophia ran the rest of her circuit. The official notification arrived at 1700 hours, delivered through Staff Sergeant Okafor, who handed her the document with an expression that was professionally neutral and personally something considerably more complicated than that. She signed the receipt. She read the notification. She filed it in the back of her notebook, where she kept the official documents, behind the folded page of incident records, and in front of the page where she'd written the name of the investigating officer Carmen had given her. That evening, the barracks felt different. Not easier. It wasn't easier, and she would have been suspicious of any version of this that felt easier. But different in the way a broken bone feels different once it has been set, still painful, still requiring careful handling, but no longer moving in a direction that would cause permanent damage. Dion found her after dinner. "Something's happening with Morrow," he said. He sat across from her, elbows on knees, speaking quietly. "One of the guys in weapons training said Morrow was called into a meeting with the Battalion S1 this afternoon. Personnel officer." Sophia looked up. "About what?" "He doesn't know, but Morrow came out of the meeting looking like someone had taken something from him." Dion paused. "And the 2 evaluation notes he co-signed for your file, the ones about counterproductive independence, they've been flagged." "Red flagged." "Somebody in the chain put a hold on them." The secondary investigation. It was running alongside the primary one, threading through the structures that had protected Whitaker for years, finding the places where those structures had bent themselves into shapes that wouldn't survive scrutiny. "What about Whitaker?" she asked. "Restricted to administrative duties as of this afternoon," Dion said. "He's off the training floor." The room absorbed that. "He's going to blame you for his career," Dion said. It wasn't a warning. It was the statement of someone thinking a situation through carefully. "When this is over, whatever the outcome, he's going to construct a story in which you destroyed a decorated veteran's life over a misunderstanding." "I know," Sophia said. "Does that bother you?" She thought about it honestly. "Yes," she said. "Because there's no version of this where he sees it clearly. There's no outcome where he understands what he was doing. He's built a story about himself that requires everything he did to have been justified, and an investigation that finds otherwise doesn't change the story he believes, it just makes him feel persecuted by the outcome. Dion was quiet. But it doesn't change whether the pattern needed to be stopped, Sophia said. His understanding of it doesn't determine whether it was real. No, Dion said. It doesn't. 3 days into the formal investigation, the twist that changed the shape of everything arrived in the form of a manila envelope. It came through the IG's office, forwarded to Drummond, who passed it to Sophia during a scheduled interview session. It contained a document Sophia had never seen before, had not known existed, had not thought to look for, because she hadn't known there was anything to look for. It was a memorandum. Internal. Dated 14 months ago. Written by XO Holbrook. Addressed to the training battalion commander. It referenced Sergeant Whitaker by name and described a pattern of recruit attrition in his assigned cohorts that was statistically anomalous, higher than average voluntary separation rates concentrated in specific demographic groups. It noted that 2 previous concern reports had been filed and dismissed. It recommended a supervisory review of Whitaker's methods. The memorandum had been received, it had been logged, it had been filed in a drawer and never acted upon, stamped at the bottom in the notation field. Reviewed. No action warranted at this time. Signed by the training battalion commander Colonel Arthur Hughes. Sophia read it 3 times. Then she looked at Drummond. Holbrook tried to flag this a year ago, she said. Yes. And Hughes buried it. That's one characterization. Drummond's voice was careful, but her eyes were not. What's certain is that a supervisory recommendation was made and not acted upon, and that the same pattern continued for 14 months after that recommendation. And Holbrook, Sophia said. He signed off on the Martinez dismissal 2 years ago. Then 14 months ago he wrote this memo. She paused. He changed his mind, or he gathered enough information over time to reach a different conclusion than the one he'd previously supported, Drummond said. People do that. It's not convenient, but it happens. Sophia thought about the conflict of interest recusal. That's why you recused him from this investigation, she said slowly. Not just because of the Martinez dismissal. Because his memo made him a material witness. I can't discuss the specifics of the recusal rationale, Drummond said. But the way she said it confirmed everything. Sophia put the memorandum down. She felt the specific feeling of a picture coming into full resolution, the slow gathering of pieces that had seemed unrelated until the moment they all clicked into position at once. Holbrook hadn't just been a passive actor in this system. He had been someone who saw the problem clearly enough to write it down, and then watched his documentation get buried by his superior officer, and had spent 14 months living with the knowledge of what that silence had cost. He wasn't the villain of this story. He was something more complicated than that. He was a man who had been wrong, and then tried to be right, and been stopped, and then been asked by circumstance to reckon with all 3 of those things at once. Can I speak with him? Sophia asked. Drummond looked at her. He's a material witness in an active investigation. I know. Sophia paused. Is there a mechanism by which a complainant can request a witness interview be included in the formal record? A long pause. There is, Drummond said. I'd like to submit that request. The interview with Holbrook happened 2 days later in the presence of the formally designated investigating officer, not the one from the Martinez case, who was now himself the subject of a separate inquiry regarding undisclosed conflicts, but a colonel named Washburn, who had been brought in from a different installation and who had the specific manner of someone determined to do a thing correctly because it was important that it be done correctly, full stop. Holbrook sat across the table from Sophia and looked at her with an expression she would remember for years. Not guilt, or not only guilt. Something more like the face of a person confronting the distance between who they intended to be and who the record showed they had been. Private Bennett, he said. Sir, she said. I want to say something before this interview begins, and I want it on the record. He looked at Washburn. For the record. Washburn nodded. Holbrook turned back to Sophia. The Martinez complaint came across my desk when I was newly in this role. I reviewed it in the context of Whitaker's service record and the assessment of my predecessor, and I signed the dismissal. He paused. I believed I was making a careful decision. I've spent 14 months understanding that I made a careless one. Sophia said nothing. "The memorandum I wrote to Colonel Hughes." Holbrook stopped, started again. "I want to be clear that I wrote that memorandum because the data was unambiguous. The attrition pattern was unambiguous. What I should have done when Hughes didn't act was escalate. Go over his head. I didn't do that." Another pause. "I filed the memo and told myself I had done my part." "Why didn't you escalate?" Sophia asked. He looked at her. "Because Hughes had 20 years of credibility, and I had 2 years in this role. And because Whitaker's combat record made any challenge to his methods feel like ingratitude. Like I was saying his service didn't count." He paused. "That was a failure of reasoning. Service and conduct are not the same ledger." Service and conduct are not the same ledger. Sophia wrote it in the notebook that night in the exact words because it was the most precise articulation she had heard of the thing that had allowed this to continue for as long as it had. The formal hearing convened on day 41, 10 days after the weapons inspection, 9 days after Okafor's incident report, 6 days after the Article 32 investigation opened, 2 days after Holbrook's testimony. Sophia sat in the hearing room in her dress uniform with Captain Simmons on one side of her and a JAG officer named Captain Ewan. On the other, Ewan had been assigned to represent Sophia's interests in the formal proceeding and had spent 4 days reviewing every page of the notebook, with an attention Sophia recognized as the attention of someone who understood what they were looking at. "This is the most complete documentation I've seen from a recruit at any stage of training," Ewan had told her the previous afternoon. "I want to be clear, what you built here isn't just a complaint, it's a case file." "I know," Sophia had said. "Where did you learn to do this?" "My father," she said. "And my brother." She paused. "And Whitaker every time he did something I needed to write down." Ewan had almost smiled at that. Now they sat across the hearing table from Whitaker and his JAG team, and Sophia looked at the man who had grabbed her collar 10 days ago and held that look until he looked away first. The hearing lasted 6 hours across 2 days. Whitaker's JAG argued the engineering narrative, the coordinated campaign, the tactical manipulation, the weaponization of regulatory language. They presented his service record in full, which was genuine and substantial and earned, and they argued that a record like his deserved a proportionate standard of evidence. Ewan let them finish. Then she presented the documentation. In sequence, in its entirety, every dated entry, every named witness, every evaluation note that Morrow had signed and that had since been red flagged, the timeline of voluntary separations in Whitaker's cohorts, Carmen Martinez's statement about her complaint's dismissal, and the undisclosed relationship between Whitaker and the investigating officer, Holbrook's memorandum, and Hughes's non-response, the informal witness interviews without legal representation that Rebecca and Garrett had documented, and finally, the thing that made Whitaker's JAG go very quiet, Okafor's independent incident report. Filed by a peer-level NCO with no personal grievance, no prior contact with Sophia, no coordination with her documentation. Filed because he had been present and had seen what happened and had decided that what he'd seen required a record. The hearing room was very quiet during Okafor's testimony. Whitaker looked at Okafor with an expression that had several layers to it, betrayal on the surface, and underneath that, something that Sophia recognized as the specific shock of someone discovering that the person they believed would stay silent had a line after all. Staff Sergeant Okafor, Whitaker's JAG, said during cross-examination, "You have served alongside Sergeant Whitaker for 3 years." "Yes, ma'am." "You've observed his training methods across multiple cohorts." "Yes, ma'am." "And you chose to file a report against a colleague based on a single incident involving a recruit who had already filed a grievance against him." Okafor looked at her steadily. "I filed a report based on what I personally observed. The recruit's prior filing doesn't change what I saw." "But surely you understand how it looks." "I understand that what I saw happened whether or not it looks convenient," Okafor said. "I've been trying to understand for 3 years how a person decides what they're willing to say out loud. Private Bennett helped me figure that out." Whitaker's JAG moved on, but the words stayed in the room. The hearing concluded its evidence phase on the afternoon of day 42. Sophia walked out of the building into the late afternoon with Ewan beside her and the specific exhaustion of someone who has been carrying something at maximum tension for a long time and has just been allowed to set it down temporarily. "How long until a finding?" she asked. 2 to 3 weeks, Ewan said. "Colonel Washburn runs a careful process." "And Hughes?" Ewan paused. "A separate inquiry has been opened regarding the handling of Holbrook's memorandum. That's a different timeline." Sophia nodded. "Sophia." Ewan stopped walking. She was looking at her with the expression of someone who has professional composure as a default setting and is allowing a departure from it. "I've been doing this for 9 years. I've seen good cases fall apart because the person at the center wasn't strong enough to hold them together under this kind of sustained pressure." She paused. "I want you to know what you did here, how you did it. It's going to be studied." Sophia looked at her. "By whom?" she asked. "By the people who decide what the training environment looks like going forward," Ewan said. "Your documentation is already being used as a reference example in discussions about anonymous reporting protocols and EO intake procedures." She paused. "You changed something before the finding even comes back." Sophia thought about that for a moment. She thought about Jerome, who had transferred out in week 2, about Angela, who had disappeared from the barracks without saying goodbye, about Carmen Martinez, who had signed paperwork and tried to put it behind her and raised a little sister who wanted to follow her into the army. She thought about all the people who had done this before her imperfectly, with less support in a system less prepared to hear them, and whose attempts had failed, not because they were wrong, but because the ground hadn't been ready for the seed yet. "It shouldn't have taken this long," Sophia said. "No," Ewan agreed. "It shouldn't have." They stood there for a moment, in the specific silence of two people who understand that being right about something doesn't make it feel any better when you think about the cost. Then Sophia straightened her uniform. She picked up the notebook, and she went back to training. Because she was still a recruit at Fort Liberty, North Carolina, and there were still requirements to meet and standards to maintain, and people around her who were watching to see whether one moment of visibility had changed who she was in the daily work of becoming a soldier. It hadn't. That was the answer she gave them without words in the way she ran the morning circuit and cleaned her weapon and sat through instruction and showed up every single day with the same precision and the same commitment she had brought on day 1. It hadn't changed who she was. It had only made who she was visible. And that it turned out was the most powerful thing of all. The finding came back on a Thursday, 17 days after the hearing concluded. 17 days during which Sophia had run every PT circuit cleaned, every weapon passed, every evaluation, and written nothing new in the notebook, because there was nothing new to document, just the daily work of being a soldier in training, which she performed with the same precision she had brought to every day before the investigation and every day during it, because that was who she was, and no outcome was going to change that. She was in the middle of a land navigation exercise when Ewan appeared at the edge of the training area. Sophia saw her from 40 meters away and knew immediately. Not from Ewan's expression, Ewan's professional composure was as intact as ever, but from the fact of her presence at this specific hour on this specific afternoon when she had no scheduled reason to be here. Sophia handed her compass to the recruit beside her. A young man named Garrett Ellison, one of her 8 witnesses, who had become in the past 17 days someone she trusted completely, and walked to meet Ewan without being asked. "Walk with me," Ewan said. They walked. "Colonel Washburn delivered his finding this morning to the convening authority," Ewan said. "It was reviewed and accepted at 1400 hours." Sophia kept her pace steady. "And Sergeant Marcus Whitaker has been found in violation of Article 93 Uniform Code of Military Justice cruelty and maltreatment of subordinates. The finding covers 7 specific incidents documented in your notebook, corroborated by witness testimony, and supported by Staff Sergeant Okafor's independent incident report." Ewan paused. "Additionally, the investigative record identified a pattern of conduct extending across multiple training cohorts over a period of not less than 30 months, with findings of fact supporting the systematic nature of the behavior." Sophia felt the words land in her chest one by one. Not like a victory. Nothing about this felt like victory. It felt like the specific, exhausting, honest relief of a thing being correctly named after a very long time of being called something else. "His rank?" she asked. "Reduced from sergeant first class to corporal effective immediately. Involuntary separation from active duty service within 60 days. Ewan paused. "His combat decorations are unaffected. The finding was explicit on that point. The recognition of his service in combat is separate from the accountability for his conduct in this role." Sophia nodded. "There's more," Ewan said. Sophia looked at her. "Colonel Hughes, the training battalion commander." Ewan's voice was precise, deliberate. "The secondary inquiry into his handling of Holbrook's memorandum concluded this morning as well. He has been formally reprimanded for failure to act on a supervisory recommendation supported by statistical evidence. He will be retired at reduced grade." A pause. He chose not to contest it. The second domino, bigger than the first, because Hughes wasn't a villain. In the way Whitaker was a villain, he was the subtler problem, the institutional failure, the person who had looked at clear evidence and decided that acting on it cost more than it was worth. And the finding against Hughes said something. The finding against Whitaker alone could not say. It said this wasn't just one man making bad choices. It was a system making the choice to protect those choices. That was the thing Sophia had needed the investigation to see. Not just one man, the whole architecture. "The IG's office is recommending 3 systemic reforms," Ewan continued. "Mandatory third-party review of voluntary separation rates by assigned NCO, starting at deviation of 15% above battalion average. Anonymous reporting access for recruits beginning in week 1 rather than week 3. And EO preliminary reports that cannot be dismissed at the base command level without IG co-review." Sophia stopped walking. She stood still for a moment. Thought about Jerome. About Angela. About Carmen Martinez at 20 years old signing paperwork trying to put it behind her. Thought about all the people who had written these same notes, not with the same precision, not with the same knowledge of what they were building, but with the same truth underneath, and had watched those notes disappear into a drawer and stay there. The reforms were not revenge. They were architecture. They were the system building itself new joints in the places where it had broken. "Sophia," Ewan said. She turned. "Are you all right?" The question caught her off guard the way honest questions sometimes do not. Because it was complicated, but because it was simple and direct, and aimed at something she had been careful not to examine too closely for the past 42 days. "I don't know yet," she said. And then because honesty deserved honesty, "Ask me in a week." Ewan looked at her for a moment. "That's the most accurate answer I've ever gotten to that question," she said. "Most people say yes immediately. Most people haven't had 42 days to watch what happens when you say things you don't mean in official contexts," Sophia said. Ewan actually smiled at that, a real one. They walked back. The news moved through the barracks, the way news always moves through a closed environment, not officially, not through announcements, but through the specific human current of people who know things, telling people who need to know them in the low, serious voices of a community, processing something significant together. By dinner, everyone knew. Dion found her at the table. He sat down across from her with his tray and didn't say anything for a full minute, which for Dion was extraordinary. Then he said, "How does it feel?" "Incomplete," she said. He looked at her. "Jerome's still gone," she said. "Angela's still gone. Carmen Martinez is still a civilian who left before she wanted to." She paused. "The finding is right. The reforms are necessary. And none of that gives back what those people lost." Dion was quiet for a moment. "No, it doesn't. But it's the difference between a wound that keeps happening and a wound that can start to heal," she said. "That's what it feels like." He nodded slowly. Then, "You know people are going to write about you." She looked up. The IG's office recommendation. The documentation methodology. Ewan told Simmons, who told Okafor, who told me that your notebook is being cited in the actual reform language as an example of the standard that anonymous reporting systems should support. He paused. "A private first class's notebook is being written into Army policy." Sophia looked down at her tray for a moment, thought about Daniel, who had said a uniform doesn't make someone powerful. Thought about her father's kitchen table and the precise, narrow-ruled handwriting he had taught her. Thought about day 4, when she had taken out the notebook for the first time and written the date and what she had observed, not because she knew where it was going, but because her father had taught her that when the truth is challenged, facts become your strongest weapon. "The notebook isn't the point," she said. "The notebook is just what happens when you pay attention and you refuse to let things be forgotten." Dion looked at her for a long time. "He chose the wrong person to make smaller," he said. She didn't answer that, but she felt it land somewhere true. Priya came to find her after dinner. She sat beside her on the bunk, and they were quiet together for a moment, in the way of people who have been through something genuinely hard and have come out the other side and are now in the strange territory of figuring out what comes after. "Garrett told me what Ewan said," Priya said, "about the reforms." "Yes." "And Hughes?" "Yes." Priya was quiet for the moment. "When I got here before you arrived, I filed a concern report in my 3rd week. A different issue, a different NCO. It was reviewed at the base command level and dismissed in 4 days. She paused. "I didn't appeal it. I didn't pursue it. I told myself it wasn't worth the cost, and I focused on getting through training, and I have spent the last 6 months wondering what would have happened if I had pushed." Sophia looked at her. "I'm not telling you so you'll say something reassuring," Priya said quickly. "I'm telling you because I want you to know that what you did changed something in me that I didn't expect. I came in here thinking the way to survive was to be smaller, quieter, less visible." She stopped, collected herself. "I'm going to appeal my dismissal." "Priya, I know it's a long shot, the timeline is complicated, but the reform language includes a review mechanism for previously dismissed reports where new systemic evidence exists." She looked at her. "Your documentation is systemic evidence." Sophia felt something expand in her chest, something too large to name precisely, but that had to do with the specific way a person feels when they understand that what they did had consequences they didn't design and couldn't have anticipated. "I'll support whatever you file," she said. "I know," Priya said. "That's not why I'm telling you." She paused. "I'm telling you because I wanted you to know that there's a version of this that doesn't end with the official finding. The real version, the version that matters, ends with people deciding they're not going to be smaller anymore. And that started with you." Sophia didn't say anything, because some things were true enough that adding words to them made them less true. The twist that nobody had anticipated arrived 6 days later in the form of a letter. It was hand-delivered to Drummond's office and forwarded through official channels to Sophia with a notation indicating that it had been reviewed for content and cleared for delivery. It was 1 page handwritten on plain paper. It was from Marcus Whitaker. Sophia held it for a long time before she opened it. She was sitting on her bunk in the early morning before formation, and the barracks were mostly quiet, and she held a sealed letter from the man who had grabbed her collar in front of 390 people and tried to dismantle everything she had built, and she thought about what it might say. She opened it. It was not an apology. Not exactly. She hadn't expected one and wouldn't have trusted a neat apology anyway. Neat apologies from people who have caused the kind of harm Whitaker had caused usually said more about the writer's need for resolution than the recipient's need for acknowledgement. What the letter said was this: "I have been a soldier for 22 years. I believed I was building soldiers. I was wrong about the method. I may have also been wrong about who I was building them for. I don't expect this to mean anything to you. I'm not certain it means what I want it to mean yet. But I have a daughter who is 18. She has talked about enlisting. I thought about what the training environment I built would feel like to her, and I couldn't finish the thought. That was all." Sophia read it twice, folded it, put it in the back of the notebook behind the official documents. She thought about it for a long time. The letter was not enough. It was not restitution, and it was not the full reckoning of a man who had genuinely understood what he had done. But it was a crack, a narrow, uncertain crack in a wall that had been solid for 22 years. And cracks she had learned from watching her father rebuild a porch that had rotted through one summer when she was 12, were how light gets into things. You didn't repair a rotten porch by covering the crack. You started there. She didn't respond to the letter. She didn't need to. Her response was already in the record, 12 pages of it, precise and dated and witnessed, saying, with perfect clarity, everything that needed to be said. Basic training concluded on day 60. The graduation ceremony was the kind of event that didn't allow for the full complexity of what the day actually contained. There was a formal structure to it, a choreography of pride and completion that was real and earned, and still somehow inadequate to hold the full weight of what 60 days at Fort Liberty had actually been. Sophia stood in formation in her dress uniform somewhere near the middle of 390 recruits, minus the ones who hadn't made it through, minus Jerome and Angela, and the others whose absence was itself a kind of testimony. She stood straight. She thought about day one, arriving with one bag and one photograph and one promise. She thought about the notebook which was now in Ewan's official custody as part of the investigative record, and which she would get back eventually, and which she had already decided she would keep for the rest of her career. Not as a trophy. As a reminder of what attention costs, and what silence costs more. After the ceremony, Tommy found her. He had the wire-rimmed glasses and the hands still pressed flat against his thighs, the way they always were when he had something to say that cost him something to say. "My father called me last night," he said. "I told him about the investigation, about what you did." He paused. He was quiet for a long time. And then he said he wanted me to tell you something. Sophia looked at him. He said, "Tell her that the people who don't make it through don't disappear. They become the reason the next person does." Tommy stopped. His jaw was tight. He meant his sailors. He also meant himself. A pause. "And he said thank you for what you did for the people who couldn't do it for themselves." Sophia felt the weight of that settle into her in the specific way of things that don't get lighter with time, but do get easier to carry. "Thank your father for me," she said. "Tell him the sailors didn't disappear. They showed up in your notebook when you needed to find the ground." Tommy pressed his hands harder against his thighs for a moment. Then he nodded, walked away. Okafor found her last. He appeared beside her with the bearing of a man who had decided something and was at peace with the decision, which was a different quality of presence than the careful, deliberately forward eyes she had first observed at the weapons inspection. "Private Bennett," he said. "Staff Sergeant, I want you to know something," he said. He wasn't looking at her with the complicated expression of someone managing guilt or performing atonement. He was looking at her directly the way people look at each other when they have been through something together and have come out respecting each other on the other side. "I filed that report because it was the right thing to do. I want to be honest with you, it took me longer than it should have to understand that. I watched things happen in that training environment for 3 years, and I told myself I didn't have the full picture." "You had enough," she said. "Yes, I did." He paused. "What changed was watching you stand there, after what he did, the way you stood. And I thought if she can hold that line with everything working against her, then the least I can do is be honest about what I saw." He paused again. "You held the line for all of us." Sophia looked at him. "No," she said. "I held my line. You held yours. Dion held his. Tommy and Priya and Rebecca and Garrett and Carmen Martinez from 2 years ago, they all held theirs." She paused. "That's the thing about lines. You can only hold your own. But when enough people hold their own lines at the same time, the thing those lines form is a wall." Okafor was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You're going to be remarkable." She went to officer candidate school 8 months later. She graduated in the top 3% of her class, which surprised nobody who knew her, and apparently surprised several people who had only been given access to the early portions of her basic training record before Morrow's evaluation notes were formally expunged. She was commissioned as a second lieutenant on a Tuesday morning in May. Her mother came. Her mother held the folded flag from Daniel's casket and cried with the specific quality of tears that are not only grief, but also recognition. The recognition of a person seeing their child become something the person they lost had always believed they could be. Her first assignment was at Fort Liberty. She requested it. Some people were surprised by that. Ewan, when she heard, called her with a single question. "Are you sure?" "Yes," Sophia said. "Why?" Sophia thought about it honestly the way she thought about everything. "Because the work isn't finished just because the finding came back," she said. "The reforms are language right now. Language has to become practice. Practice has to become culture. That doesn't happen automatically." She paused. "And it doesn't happen if the people who understand why it matters aren't in the room where it's being built." There was a silence on the line. "I'll make some calls," Ewan said. At Fort Liberty, Lieutenant Sophia Bennett was assigned to a training battalion that was in the first month of implementing the new anonymous reporting protocols and the revised EO intake procedures that had come directly out of the investigation. Her commanding officer was Colonel Washburn. He called her into his office on her first day and looked at her across his desk with the expression of a man who has read a complete file and understands exactly who is sitting in front of him. "Lieutenant Bennett," he said. "Sir? I want to be direct with you." He paused. "Your presence here is not a coincidence. I requested you specifically." He let that land. "The reform implementation is encountering resistance in places I expected and in places I didn't. The language is on paper. Getting people to understand why it matters what it costs when it doesn't exist, that's a different problem." "Yes, sir," she said. "I need someone who can talk to recruits, not in a formal briefing context, in the real context, the daily actual this is what it means context." He looked at her. "Are you willing to do that?" "That's what I came back for," she said. He nodded. Something in his face settled the way settled things do when they find the right position. "One more thing," he said. "Holbrook wants to meet with you. He asked me to ask. He doesn't expect you to agree." Sophia had thought about this possibility. Had thought about what she would say if it arrived. "Set it up," she said. Holbrook walked into the room looking like a man who had spent 18 months carrying something he'd finally decided to put down, even though putting it down didn't make it any lighter, just freed his hands for other things. He sat across from her. "I don't have a prepared statement," he said. "Good," she said. "I don't either." He looked at her for a moment. "I want to be useful," he said. "Whatever that looks like. Whatever you think it can look like given everything." He stopped. "I signed a dismissal that shouldn't have been signed. I wrote a memorandum that should have been escalated and wasn't. I can't undo those things." "No," she agreed. "But you can be someone who tells that story honestly. To recruits. To NCOs. To anyone who needs to understand how the system allows what it allows." She paused. "A person who made the wrong choice and is willing to explain exactly why is more useful than a cautionary tale. Cautionary tales are about other people. What you can offer is a first-person account." Holbrook was quiet for a long time. "I can do that," he said. She nodded. "Sophia." He stopped himself. "Lieutenant Bennett." "Sophia is fine." "Sophia." He looked at her with the full weight of everything that had happened between them, not directly, not face to face, but through the record, through the documents, through the long chain of events that had begun with her notebook and ended here. "What you did was not just brave. What you did was precise. And that precision, the fact that you didn't just feel what was happening, but documented what was happening, that's what made it impossible to look away from." "My father taught me to write things down," she said. "I'll make sure that gets passed on," he said. She went to work. Not the dramatic work of confrontation and investigation and formal findings that work was done. The work she went to now was quieter, and in some ways harder. It was the work of presence, of daily consistency, of showing up in a training environment that was still in the process of becoming something different from what it had been, and doing the 1,000 small things that moved it incrementally toward what it was supposed to be. She talked to recruits in their first week. Not in briefings. In the actual spaces of their days, in the few minutes before a session started, in the walking time between locations, in the late evenings when people were tired enough that performance fell away and honest questions surfaced. She told them about the notebook. Not as an inspirational story, as a practical tool. The reason documentation works, she told a group of 8 recruits one evening, is not because it's dramatic. It's because it's boring. It's dates and times and specific words and names of people who were present. Drama can be argued with. Dates and times are just dates and times. A young woman in the group slight, with the careful eyes of someone who had already been taking in more than she was saying, raised her hand. "What if you write it all down and nobody listens?" Sophia looked at her. "Some people didn't listen," she said. "Some people who should have acted didn't act. That's in the record too, and those people faced consequences for it." She paused. "The question isn't whether the system will be perfect. The question is whether there's a record that makes it impossible for the system to pretend it didn't know." The young woman held her gaze for a long moment. Then she took out a notebook. A small one, with a hard cover and narrow-ruled pages. Sophia recognized it. She had bought the same kind at a drugstore 6 weeks before shipping out. "Good," Sophia said. She meant it as more than a writing tip, and the young woman heard it that way. 6 months into her assignment at Fort Liberty, the anonymous reporting system logged 43 preliminary reports, more in 6 months than the previous 3 years combined. Of those 43, 19 led to formal reviews. Of those, 1911 resulted in findings that led to changes in assigned personnel training methods or supervisory structures. Not all of them were dramatic. Most of them weren't. Most of them were quiet corrections. A training method adjusted a boundary. Redrawn, a pattern interrupted before it had time to become an architecture. The kind of changes that don't make headlines and don't get written into findings, but accumulate over time into a training environment where fewer people quietly disappear and more people complete what they came to do. That was the measure Sophia kept in her head. Not the dramatic outcomes, those were real, but rare. The daily measure. The ambient cumulative change in what people felt they were allowed to say, and what they believed would happen if they said it. On a Wednesday morning, exactly 2 years after she had arrived at Fort Liberty, as a private with one bag, and one photograph, and one promise, Lieutenant Sophia Bennett stood in front of a formation of 400 new recruits and looked at the faces looking back at her. She saw herself in them. Not literally, they were 400 different people with 400 different histories and 400 different reasons for being here. But she saw the specific quality they shared, which was the quality of standing at the beginning of something enormous and not yet knowing what it would cost. She had one thing to tell them. "The uniform you're about to put on does not make you powerful," she said. "You know what makes you powerful?" She paused. "Let it sit. The choices you make while you're wearing it." Daniel had said that to her once, standing in the kitchen on a Tuesday morning, his uniform pressed, and his boots polished 1 week before the deployment that killed him. She had carried it under her sternum for 2 years. She was still carrying it. And now she was passing it forward into 400 people who would carry it into the army, and into the world, and into every room they would ever walk into, wearing that uniform. The understanding that power was not what you were given when someone handed you rank, but what you chose to do with every moment of authority you were ever trusted with. She had been afraid on the training field. She had been afraid every single day of the 42 days that followed. She had been afraid the morning she called Carmen Martinez at 4:58, and the afternoon she sat across from Holbrook, and the hour she waited for Ewan to walk to the edge of the land navigation field with the look that meant the finding had come back. Fear was not the opposite of courage. Fear was the condition under which courage happened. 390 witnesses had watched her fall into that moment on the training field, collared and alone, standing in front of a decorated sergeant with the full weight of the institution behind him. What they remembered, what Dion and Priya and Tommy and Rebecca and Garrett and Okafor and Carmen Martinez and Holbrook and Ewan and Colonel Washburn and every recruit who had ever held a small hard-covered notebook would carry forward, was not the falling. It was the standing back up, and the staying stood. That was all courage ever was. Not the absence of fear, not the single dramatic moment of defiance that the story gets remembered for. It was the decision made quietly and renewed every single day to stay standing in the face of everything designed to make you smaller. Sophia Bennett had made that decision on day 1. She was still making it. She would keep making it for the rest of her life. And the army, her army, the one she had fought to make worthy of what the uniform was supposed to mean, would never be exactly the same as it was before a 23-year-old woman with a notebook and her father's handwriting and her brother's words under her sternum, decided that the truth deserved to be written down.